I'm here to talk to you about our Spectrum lesson for this coming Sunday. We're in the season of Epiphany and thinking about all of the different places that we see God at work in our world today. So far, we've talked about how we see God as we learn and grow in our faith. We've seen God in the help and support of friends, and today we're going to talk about how we see God when people who've been left out are included and brought back into the group. And to do that, we'll be looking at a story from Mark chapter 5. This is a story where Jesus has just arrived at a new town and is met by a huge crowd. And as everyone gathers around him, Jesus is approached by a man named Jairus, who's a leader at one of the local synagogues. And Jairus' daughter is near death. She's very ill, and he pleads for Jesus to come with him and heal his sick daughter. Jesus agrees, and as they're moving towards Jairus' house, the crowd follows them. And amongst the crowd is a woman who's been ill for 12 years. She's had bleeding and has been ill this whole time. She's seen lots of doctors who've been unable to help her. She's spent almost all her savings trying to get better and still is sick. This illness she has would have made her ritually unclean. She would have been unable to participate in regular community life. She would have been left out of festivals, of family dinners. She wouldn't have been able to do much of anything. So she would have been considered an untouchable in Hebrew society back then. And she is desperate for help. So as this crowd's moving along, this woman approaches Jesus, but rather than speak to him, she simply reaches out and grabs his cloak, the fringe of his cloak, which we guess probably would have been his prayer shawl that most devout Jews wore back then. The fringe of that was hanging down. And as soon as she touches this, she immediately becomes better. Jesus senses that something's happened, and he stops, and he looks around and asks, "Who is it who touched me?" And eventually when this woman speaks and says it was her, he responds, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Jesus then continues on to Jairus' house, where he brings Jairus' daughter back to health and life. And we see these two parallel women both receiving gifts of healing and wholeness from Jesus. It's a great story. It's one you should definitely read for yourself before the lesson. It's chapter 5, verses 21 to 43 in Mark. But with the kids on Sunday morning, we're going to focus just on the middle story, the story of the woman who'd been ill for 12 years. Mark has a habit of, or a technique, I guess, more than a habit, of inserting stories inside each other. The fancy term for this is intercalation. But what he does is he'll start a story, and then before that story ends, he'll stick another story in between it. And this is to let us know that something important is happening. The first thing we notice is that these two stories, the one in the middle and the one on either side of the sandwich, have things in common. So in this case, it's two women, both of whom are sick, both of whom are unclean. And then we also notice that Jesus responds to people in these stories who have faith. So he notices, "Your faith has made you well." Jesus observes that for the woman, and he observes that for Jairus as well. So that's a common theme in them both. And one thing I really like about Mark is he emphasizes the way Jesus brings people together and includes outsiders. And that's what we see happening in this story. So the woman who was unclean couldn't have done anything much in society and would have been an outcast or an untouchable, or, there are lots of different ways that we can think about her place in society, none of which are positive. And as we think about our world today, I think there are still people who we consider untouchable or unclean, or people that we would just rather not spend time with or be around, people that our society tends to ignore. And the kids will probably have acquaintances like this in school or in their communities. There may be kids in the class who act out, who, if you're put in a group with them to do a project, you think, "Oh, why is that person in my group?" There are lots of ways that we can bring this to life for the children when we review the story with them. And the thing to take away from this story is that Jesus responds to this woman, and he heals her and brings her back into community. When the woman's illness was healed, she would have been able to come back into society. She would have been able to participate again. She would no longer be cast outside the city walls to where all of the unclean women had to wait until a certain amount of time had passed. She can come back in, she can, prepare food, she can go to religious services, she can interact with other people. She's no longer this outcast. She's brought in to the family, into the community. And that's something that we see Jesus doing throughout his ministry. And it's something that the church is called to still do today. And all of us, whether we're young or old, can include people who are being left out and find people who are being ignored or who aren't being heard and try to find ways to include them and to give their voice a place where people will listen. We could especially think about this in the context of the refugee crisis as well, where these are people who've been through awful things at home and who are now trying to make a new home in Europe, and nobody wants them. Very few people want them. They have trouble finding a place to stay. When they do get here, there are lots of hurdles for them to overcome, from language to housing to culture. And it may be that we as a church have a role in helping to make these people feel welcome and included in our society. And it'd be interesting to ask the kids about that and see what they think and see if there are ideas they have, in our community here, in their schools, or in Edinburgh or in Scotland, about ways that we can make people feel welcome and included and whole, part of our neighborhood, part of our community of God's great big family. So that's a big overview introduction into the story. We'll act it out upstairs, so the kids will get the story upstairs. When you come down, we'll form our circle as usual and have Bill's big question. We'll collect the offering, and you'll check in with the kids to hear the best and worst parts of their week. And then instead of watching a video for the story, I thought it'd be fun if we played a wee running game. We'll have the story rearranging relay, where on one side of the room we'll put envelopes that have 4 plot points in them that are in the wrong order. And you'll split the kids into 4 groups, and they will take turns running back and forth across the hall, and each time they go, they'll get 1 plot point from their envelope and bring it back to their team. And once they have all 4, they'll have to put them in the correct order to tell the story that we heard upstairs. And once they've finished and they think they're in the correct order, one of the leaders, one of you, can check to make sure it's right, and then review with everybody else to make sure all of the teams have their story in the correct order, and review what happened and what it means, and ask some of these reflective questions with the kids to make sure that they understand what the story's about and to think about what it means for us today. I hope that this goes really well. After you do the story review, Elizabeth Tetkin and Rachel Cadell will be coming down again to play some music for us and to teach us a song for the music night next week. The song that they're teaching us is Do, a deer, a female deer, do, re, mi, from The Sound of Music. If you finish up that and there's still time left at the end of your lesson, there are notes for a few games, both circle games and running around games, in the lesson plan that will come with this email. And you can check those out and leave them as well, or a game of your choosing. Thanks very much.